I need to deliver a trigger warning before this talk. It does contain references to middle school, so everybody, this is Andrew Eck.
Hello, everybody. My name is Andrew Eck. As Justice just introduced me, I'm very happy to be here. If there are any dads in the audience, you can say to yourself, "Hi, very happy to be here. I'm Dad." I say this as a fellow dad. Yeah, thank you, thank you. So this talk, what I learned about code review from teaching 8th grade poetry. The title isn't quite accurate. It's closer to 9th grade poetry. But still, I can imagine if you feel just as skeptical as Tater Tot here. So a little bit about myself to introduce. I'm the director of development for a little consultancy called Unabridged Software. So I spend about half of my time writing software for clients and about half of my time doing teaching and learning and working with organizations on their own internal teaching and learning to make sure that so the organization, much like the code base, can respond to change and grow and take advantage of opportunities as they come instead of like, well, that would sure be cool, but we don't have anyone who knows how to do that, which is fine. It's just not a very interesting answer. I'm on social media. I can be reached at email. I'll post this again at the very end. There's my company logo. They paid for me to be here, so I promised I would show the logo. I live in Lincoln, Nebraska with these two nerds, my wife and my kid, and also this very adequate cat. He's great. I love him so much. He's my best friend. So let's talk about some terms first. I want to introduce a little bit of vocabulary. These are 4 terms that we are going to come back to several times through the talk. The first is usefulness. The slides are up on Twitter, so if you want to see citations for anything, you can see the citations there. Usefulness, in this case, comes from a study that was done by Microsoft. They evaluated about 15 million pull requests, change requests, however, like whatever the Microsoft nomenclature is for that, and specifically feedback that was given to them. A useful comment was one that inspired a change in code that otherwise would not have been there, whereas a non-useful comment, per the study, was like, I like how you did this, which is nice and feels good, but in this case did not inspire change. So we're going to use a slightly less strict version of usefulness as far as like something that inspires change that otherwise would not have been there. The next term that we're going to use is usefulness density. So of the however many comments that are left on a pull request or code review or whatever the case may be, what percentage of them were useful and what percentage of them were not? Usefulness density is a term that we'll come back to. Next, we'll talk about transference, just very briefly. Transference, I don't mean this in the Freudian way. That would be way more complex than I care to deal with in this particular talk. If there are any psychology majors in the room, you're probably going, oh no, please don't talk about Freud. In this case, transference is a cognitive psychology term. My background is as a teacher, and so it's when you learn something in one domain that transfers over and helps you to like be better or more skilled in another seemingly unrelated domain. And lastly, we're going to get just a little bit Aristotelian about it and talk about virtues. And we'll come back to this here in just a second. It's like things that are good. I think it was Zach who mentioned like, where's your fun? That'd be like another perspective into this. So let's talk about this hairy beast that is poetry. So I'm a software developer. For about the first 10 years of my professional career, I made my living teaching poetry and also performing poetry. So I've traveled around the country doing both. And in this particular case, the case study that I'm going to be looking at is a 2-year residency that I did with a high school in Lincoln, Nebraska, where I went and visited them once or twice a week throughout the school year in order to help them get ready for the Louder Than a Bomb poetry tournament, which if you're a Chicago person, probably you've heard of. And so we did practice. So I would show up after school. They would read me their poems. I would, like a teacher, mark up their drafts and then give them back. And then they would make changes, bring them back later, and so on and so on. And it was fine. It worked okay. But I had a lot of students, and they really wanted to write, and they really wanted to perform. So over a given 60-minute practice or so, we would be able to get through at most maybe 8 students' poems, one from each. And usually it meant that I had a backlog of about 30, if not more, students who are waiting to be heard from. And if you can do that arithmetic, that means that we get through like the whole cycle of students about once a month, which was not excellent. as far as a backlog goes. So in thinking about this, we started to evaluate, like, I know this doesn't feel right, but why doesn't it feel right? One of the reasons, which you just alluded to, is that low throughput, right? It takes a long time to get through all the students, which means that most of my students were just hanging out, waiting to be heard at some point in the next 31 days, which isn't excellent. The next bit is lots of idle time. So along with that waiting, students were, literally waiting. We would do the thing where I and the 15 or 20 students who were there would sit. One student would stand up in front of us and perform. Then we would give them feedback. The whole process took like 8 to 10 minutes. Selfishly, I would give most of the good feedback early, which meant that by the time we got to the students, they were either tired of listening to me and had tuned out, or would say like very nice, supportive things, but that weren't necessarily constructive. And then because of time, usually the student who received the feedback did not have time to perform again, and instead had to wait 30 days or so before they could stand up again. So that long feedback loop, right? There was a long period of time between making a change and then determining if that change was successful. Finally, with that came the lost context, right? Some wonderful 9th grader would stand up and read this poem that was kind of started, and they wanted to know where to go with it. And that's cool if they happened to be in the queue for that day, but if they had to wait for some number of weeks, it was almost guaranteed that they would have forgotten. And I don't say this as a slam against 9th graders. Yeah, thank you. I don't say this as a slam against 9th graders. It's hard to maintain that internal context, and it's hard to keep that. So it meant that a lot of really cool starts to poems and performances were lost because we lost the draft in the ensuing some number of weeks. We forgot what it was about. Our feelings changed. Whatever the case may be, a lot of cool work was lost. So we made some changes. We said, oh dear, we need to make some changes. One of the things that we thought about was, that I thought about, my co-teacher, a woman named Katie F.S., who's my very favorite co-teacher, was asking, what is the outcome that we actually care about? Is the outcome that we care about that the students have great poems, or is there something else that we care about more? And the thing that we decided we cared about more was that the students were being able to share their work, being heard relatively quickly, being given feedback, and being given opportunity to work with that, and then more importantly, building that community, sharing that knowledge. It's cool if I can stand up there and be like, yes, you need to make this change, and here's what needs to happen. Even more cool if the students can do it instead of me, right? Way cooler if the students can do it instead of me. So we made a couple of changes. And the big change that we made was that instead of all of us being together as a group, where one person stands up, receives their judgment, sits down, waits for 4 weeks, and then we repeat the cycle for some number of other folks, I broke the students into groups of usually 3 or 4. One of them would perform, another would record with a smart device, a camera, whatever the case may be. They would sit down all together, just the group of 3 or 4, watch it, and then talk about the poem in real time as they were watching the performance. And then immediately, the student who has just performed would do it again, but would make 1 or 2 changes, whatever those might be. Now again, these were high schoolers, these were relative novices, these were not seasoned professionals who made their living from this, which meant that early on, the feedback that they gave each other was not great. Not bad. It was supportive, it was loving, it was great community, but it wasn't great as far as the technical proficiency. But because there were so many groups, and because I was already kind of bopping from group to group, just bopping right down that bunny trail. I have a 3-year-old at home, so we have a lot of bunny trails and things like that. I was able to work with students on feedback. So instead of giving feedback on performances itself, it was, hey, say more about that. That's an interesting thing that you just said, but I don't think it's take it a little further. And what happened over a couple of weeks, probably about 6, was that my students started giving each other better feedback and faster feedback. And what ultimately we arrived at was that they were doing, frankly, about as good of a job as giving feedback as I was, except instead of just me and 1 student and a bunch of idle folks, it was 8 students at a time getting feedback, largely without my intervention, which is really cool. We hit that point where students were doing things without me. We hit the point where things were happening in parallel rather than serially. And we hit a point where we weren't seeing any drop off in quality at all. Not that like poem quality was the single metric that I cared about, harkening back to the talk just a few minutes ago, but it was a useful metric. And so quantitatively, we saw a much faster cycle time. A student could bring a draft and and instead of like having opportunities to work that draft to completion over a couple of months, they could do so over a week, maybe 2, and hit that same point much faster. So we saw faster cycle time. We saw with that like a much tighter feedback loop in that a student could try something, get feedback, see if it was successful, try it again, get feedback, see if it was successful, try it again, get feedback, see if it was successful, such that they were able to do like usually 4 or 5 performances per practice instead of 1 every 4 weeks. So that's that number is good. And then lastly, we didn't see that drop in quality, and instead we saw like a huge boost to team cohesion. Because they were giving each other feedback instead of waiting for me to do it, they liked each other a lot more. And because they were receiving feedback as well as giving it, they got pretty good at being kind. There are folks in life who, I have this a bias, a prejudice, against the notion of like brutal honesty, in that it often feels like folks value the brutal part rather than the honest part. I know, right? Called out, perhaps. But in the past, particularly early in my career as a teacher, it's like, I have to give like hardcore feedback and I have to really justify this grade. And if I do this well enough, the students will improve. And it turns out they probably didn't as well as they could have, relative to like later in my teaching career when I was nicer. But because these students were giving each other feedback and receiving feedback quickly and reliably and continuously, they were a lot kinder about it. It was like, I see what you're doing. It doesn't land for me for these reasons. I wonder what we can do about it, as opposed to your poem sucks and you should feel bad, which is a poetry slam thing to do, but it doesn't have to be. So let's talk a little bit about some of the research behind this. And this it's going to tie into code review here in just a second. The first thing that I want to talk about is Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. Lev Vygotsky was a cognitive psychologist with the USSR, and he was tasked with creating like a communist educational system. So some of the stuff that he came up with was kind of state-sponsored. But one of the things that he came up with that has stuck and continues to stick is this notion of a zone of proximal development, which is to say that if you are learning, you're probably going to learn about as quickly, if not more so, from somebody who's maybe a step ahead of you as you are from an expert. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is like, it's easier to be vulnerable with peers. Another reason for that, though, is that somebody who's just a step ahead of you knows what it's like to solve the problems that you're working with right now. So zone of proximal development. These students were, they were learning from each other at least as fast as they would have from me, which was really cool to see. So I was able to come in and help with just like a little bit, like you're like right onto something, let's push it just a step further, and then I could leave, and they would take it the rest of the way. It was pretty cool. The next thing is the notion of feedback versus evaluation. I had approached this as though I were grading a paper. I had to give feedback and do it such that I could evaluate a grade. That was the mental model that I was working from, even though I wasn't grading. With the students, they were giving feedback. It was, in the moment, here's something that I think maybe would, if you tried it, would help. Let's see what happens. So it lowers the stakes, lowers the need to quantify. The last thing, as far as research, this is Dylan William. He's an educational assessment researcher. And he talks about how there are many qualities of good feedback. It has to be specific, measurable, actionable, timely, relevant, things like that. But the biggest predictor as whether somebody is going to take and act upon a piece of feedback is almost never the quality of the feedback, and instead how much they trust the person giving the feedback. So that notion of a relationship. If there's somebody you trust who has terrible ideas, but you trust them, you might very well act on it. If so-and-so jumped off a bridge, would you do it too? Yeah, if I trust him. Why not? Okay. So let's bring this to code review. Formal code review was invented by a dude named Fagan back in 1976, or at least formalized in a published paper. It involved getting a bunch of people together in a room with a printout of the code and going through it line by line, by line, by line. And it sucked. In more recent articles that I've read about Fagan-style code review, the authors suggested that you could get through about 7% of your code base in a given year, or about 7% of the changes to your code base in a given year, which, not great. So we practice usually what's a more modern form of code review, which is, say, it's tool-based, asynchronous. GitHub pull requests are great examples of like modern code review, in that your changes are up, somebody can review them, they can leave annotated line-level comments. Boom, it's modern, it's slick, it's super fun, so we can do that. And then there's also, which may be useful, ad hoc, or sometimes called over-the-shoulder code review, which is, hey, come look at this for a second. So that's exactly what it seems. The explicit goal of code review, and this is defined by Fagan, is to catch defects. But there are also, and this is, I think, valid. A study at Google, and this is cited in the slides, suggested that only about 30% of code reviews actually do catch defects. And there's some argument that, like, well, you still got to do that 30, you still got to do as many of your code reviews as you can, so that way you get that 30%. I think, though, that with code review, the metaphor that I usually see lived out is the code reviewer as teacher, right? I'm taking your code, I'm gonna mark it up with my red pen, you're gonna fix it, you're gonna give it back to me, and when it is good enough, I will merge it. That's the metaphor that I usually see, but I think, and this is my core argument here, is that we can democratize and flatten the code review process as a means of sharing power, as a means of sharing knowledge, and as a means of building like team community in ways that are kind of interesting. So with that, we have implicit code review goals that I think are sometimes ignored. One of them is maintaining an updated and accurate mental model. If I'm working on a large enough code base with enough people, there are going to be changes happening to that code base that I don't even know about, which means then that when I go to look at my code base, I'm like, holy shit, when did this happen? That is sometimes, often in my case, it's because I wrote it while I was sleepy, but not always, right? So being able to keep an accurate mental model then means that when I'm trying to debug an issue or add new functionality or change functionality or just understand what's happening, maybe I can spend a little bit less time, maybe I have fewer incorrect assumptions, maybe. Then the other bit, which we just mentioned, we can have this implicit goal of sharing knowledge and power. Pretty much everybody, I don't know if this is true everywhere, but at least in Lincoln, Nebraska, almost every company is looking to hire senior level engineers, and the only candidates who are available are usually fresh university grads. So there's a bit of a disjunct. And so the place where I do a lot of my training work is how do you take your junior level folks and train them up such that in 3 years or in 5 years or in 10 years, you don't need to hire senior level folks because you've already grown them. That's a lot of my work, but I think that sharing knowledge and power is often ignored in teams. So let's talk about obstacles to code review. This is a very brief little bit. The first obstacle that we often see is insufficient time, particularly when it comes to like reviewing everything. And I've been on teams and I've been responsible for teams even where there's a big old backlog of code reviews, branches that have been open sometimes for weeks, if not months, that then when the reviewer finally got to them, it is, wait a second, what is this supposed to do again? Wait a second, what's going on here? And the author of the code didn't always know because it had been several weeks, if not several months. And that sucks. I really dislike, personally, I really dislike the experience of going into code and knowing that I wrote it and thinking, I have no idea what this does or what it's supposed to do. That's not a very fun feeling. But that was the thing that we found again and again. And the reason that we had that backlog was because we were not devoting time to this. When I was teaching, I would take my papers home, I would grade them in the evening. I lived by myself in a crappy little basement apartment in the middle of Kansas, and I didn't have anything to do. But as a developer, I wasn't able to do that in the same way. The other reason that we often don't share the code review powers is like, well, it's me plus a bunch of junior developers. What are they gonna do? They don't know enough. And that might be true, but it doesn't have to be true for very long. So I want to talk about a case study. This is Payment Spring. It's a payments gateway that I worked for a while. We had the problem of a huge backlog of work, and because we were a PCI Level 1 certified payments gateway, everything that we did had to be reviewed, sometimes by multiple reviewers in accordance with our compliance policies around that, because we were encrypting credit card data. As it turns out, once you start touching credit card data, the rules and the stakes go way up. So instead of waiting for my team lead to review things, he was off like gallivanting on business trips, trying to scare at business that we wouldn't go under. Instead of waiting for him to review things, my fellow developers and I started reviewing them on our own and merging them on our own. We took a little bit of a risk there. And we found a couple of things that were interesting. The first thing that we found was that after a period of time, after probably about 5 weeks, there was no drop-off in quality of code. It was virtually indistinguishable. The second thing that we found was that fewer defects, fewer bugs escaped, and that was because we didn't have a tired senior developer reviewing literally dozens of pull requests in the middle of the night after a long day of flying and conferences and meetings and things like that. The third thing that we found was that we started collaborating a lot more. So instead of waiting for the code review process to seek feedback, we started seeking feedback much earlier. And we started getting a lot better at seeking and at giving feedback. It went from, I am the teacher, here's my red pen, you need to fix this, to, I think this code breaks down in this particular edge case, and I don't see that reflected in the tests. Would you mind checking for me? Which is a much kinder and friendlier way to frame things. So it goes back to our big hairy question to some degree. But in reflecting on these experiences, the thing that I had to think about, and this is like the hairy question, not the going back to, but this is the hairy question, was it an accident? Was it a function of the people? Was it, why did this happen? Why did it go so well? Why were we at Payment Spring able to integrate new developers so quickly? Why at Lincoln High were we able to integrate new poets so quickly? Why did this happen? And I think the research ultimately backs this up. One of the things, this comes out of the same study at Microsoft where usefulness was described. One of the things that they found was that the single biggest predictor of usefulness density, that is to say the single biggest predictor of whether a single comment left by a reviewer is useful or not, is not that reviewer's level, not the number of lines of code that they committed to the code base at large, nor the number of lines of code that they committed to the code base in that particular file, but the number of times that they had reviewed that particular file. Usefulness, the expected usefulness almost across the board was about 30% likely for somebody who had seen the file, who's seeing the file for the first time, up to about 70% likely to be useful for somebody who's seen the file 5 times or more, and then it plateaus more or less after that. And that was irrespective of level, irrespective of tenure at the company, irrespective of the amount of time or the amount of changes that somebody had made, which is interesting then because it means that the single best way to give better code review is to give code review, right? The single best way to like become familiar with something is to become familiar with it. And it frees us a little bit from the dogma of the idea that only the senior developer, only the architect or whoever is the one who's allowed to review things. We can ask our junior developers to review. Yeah, they're not going to be super useful right off. Give them a couple of weeks, they will be, which is kind of exciting. The next thing, and this is kind of, there's research behind this, I don't have this cited, is that people with habits continue those habits. If I am in the practice of seeking out feedback, I'm probably going to continue doing that. If I am in the practice of reviewing code and making time to do that, I'm probably going to continue, which is exciting. It means then that if we can build those habits, if we can create changes that make those habits possible, we can rely a little bit on momentum, which is kind of exciting. And the last thing is that the only way to improve is with practice. There's probably many of you are young enough to have gone through the what is my learning style in school, where there's like audio or visual or kinesthetic. And I'm sad to say that there's no supporting research behind that at all. There's zero supporting research behind that. There are ways to present information, some of them audio, some of them visual, but the only way to actually improve is to do, which is kind of exciting. Because then it means that instead of doing the like, well, I can't trust my junior developers to do this because they'll probably do it wrong, you have to let them do this, and you have to encourage them to do this so that they can eventually learn to get it right. And when I say eventually, I'm usually talking a cycle time of somewhere between a couple of weeks and a couple of months, rather than many years. So it brings us to the core thesis, right? So the first thing is that code review does catch defects in code. I think that's empirically accurate. The second thing is that code review, when practiced, and I come from teams where we review every single line of code, and it doesn't matter if a junior developer wrote it or if my boss, who's probably the best developer I've ever worked with, wrote it. I'm still going to pull their code, run through the tests, do the exact same evaluation, and treat it exactly the same. But having that means that I usually understand the code base relatively well. And code review does, though, boost that understandability. And so I ask my junior developers even, please review this code. Make sure that it's clear to you, not because I need my ego flattered. I do sometimes, but that's not the junior developer's responsibility. That's my responsibility. But because you are almost certainly going to be responsible for this code someday. I will move to another project. I will leave the company. I will get eaten by wolves, whatever the case may be. Somebody else is going to take responsibility for this code. So let's make sure they can. Along with that, having that code review means that we have that accurate mental model. And then finally, maybe this is semi-finally, I don't have my slide previews up, code review can be an avenue towards sharing power. How cool is it, if you're a junior developer, to have a senior developer come to you and say, hey, I would love for you to review my work to make sure that I didn't miss anything and to make sure that it's understandable, right? Maybe a junior developer doesn't feel qualified, and there are some problems that they aren't qualified for, and that's okay. But can you read this and make sense of it? Can you figure out what's going on? If so, cool. If it's understandable, we can make changes later. If it's not understandable, then we're just going to feel really sad about it when we do have to make changes later, which is okay. We can feel whatever we feel. But what if we set ourselves up to feel less sad? What if we set ourselves up to feel just a little bit more joy? So takeaways. I'm a big fan of code review. Again, like every single line of code. And I think it's worthwhile to do. But if you want to put this into practice, first thing, please do use version control if you're not in the habit of this already. A couple of years ago, I was teaching a boot camp, and one of the bigger companies that wanted to interview my students had talked about how they were going to start using version control in the next couple of years. They were a bank and ran credit card processing software. And I was so sad for them. The next thing, this is probably more important, but I want to get the first one out of the way, is practice that compassion, seeking understanding. So can we write this, like when I am reading my code, can I understand it? Can I understand where somebody's coming from? Can I ask them about the decisions they made and how they got here? I probably don't know as much about the business case or about this feature as the person who wrote it. In fact, I guarantee that I don't. But can I say, probably they're doing the best job they can. Please tell me more about how you made this decision so that I can understand it. Great, we could have a conversation around that, as opposed to, hey, ding dong, why did you do this? It's harder to have a conversation that way. The next thing that's useful, I think, is establishing the shared language and expectations. Some of this is just like, when we talk about code, can we talk about it in the same way? Some of this also with the expectations is, what qualities of code within our code base make it pleasant to work with and satisfying to work with? Can we do that? Can we like build those qualities in the work that we do? The answer is usually yes, but not always. But having that shared language means that you're having somewhat consistent conversations, somewhat consistent ways of describing things, which makes the code review process a little bit better. Preferring smaller changes helps. If you're reviewing 10,000 lines of code, it is likely that you will miss something. If you're reviewing 10 lines of code, you still might miss something, but it's a little bit less likely. Not completely, but a little bit less. And then finally, and this is the thing that you can do even if you're in an organization that does not practice code reviews, even if you're on a team that does not practice code reviews, even if there's institutional resistance from like layer or layers above you, you can ask your teammates to look at your stuff. You can say, hey, Bruce, would you mind coming and sitting next to me and just reading through this to make sure that I'm not missing anything based on this spec? That's something that you can do without any permission from like higher ups, which is kind of exciting. So being able to go just a little bit rogue in that regard does help. I'm all about the tiny, quiet rebellions. Also the loud ones when they need to happen, but tiny, quiet ones pretty much daily. And then finally, this comes out of a study from Google. Most changes only need 1 or 2 reviewers. Some organizations will put everybody in a room, we sit down, we dissect everything, but it doesn't have to be that way. Probably you can just have 1 or 2 people sit by, which is kind of exciting. It means that you have fewer friction points and you can move just a little bit faster. It also means that one of those 1 or 2 people can be a junior dev or a mid-level dev or a senior dev, whatever you feel like on a given day. And then finally, this one's kind of counterintuitive. When possible, leave fewer comments. Some of this is not catching things. It's not spending your time on like white space and formatting and things that like any linter can fix. Some of this also, though, when you leave a wall of comments, and I found this when I was teaching, it is difficult for students to know which one is best, which one is like most important. Similarly, when you leave a wall of comments on a big line of code, on a big change request, it is difficult sometimes for the person receiving that feedback to prioritize. If you can pick the 1 or 2 things, awesome. Okay, last thing, audit. Review your code reviews, see if they're effective. I'm done.